أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. Respected Naib Amir Sahib, organizers of the West Coast Jalsa Salana, my fellow brothers and sisters, my fellow guests of the Promised Messiah, alayhi salam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I am deeply honored to be invited to speak to you at this auspicious occasion on the topic of Al-Khaliq, Al-Bari, and Al-Musawwir, the creator, the maker, the fashioner, understanding the Islamic perspective on evolution. I am a practicing scientist as well as a practicing Muslim. Yet I cannot claim any authority on this topic assigned to me. Instead, I can only offer my own perspective on this vast subject based on my own experience teaching evolutionary biology at the university level within the context of animal behavior for over a decade to both undergraduates and graduates. My own informal study, such as it is, of Quranic verses related to the subject, and what I've learned, however imperfectly, from religious instruction. Therefore, the reflections I provide you today are not representative of anyone other than myself. Moreover, the details of this story, this topic of evolution, are vast and voluminous and technical. So I've taken care here to try and restrict my analysis to the verse I just recited, and it was recited more beautifully in Tilawat al-Quran earlier. And I'm only touching upon what are complex subjects in referential ways in the short time that I have at my disposal. So lest you walk away completely disappointed after these disclaimers, what I can also offer perhaps humbly is some insight on how my own personal journey into science has made me understand and appreciate this verse, and allows me to share some insights into how this verse helps guide how I work as a scientist and how I understand the concept of evolution. My talk will be divided into three parts. The first is a background about this verse and the definitions of the attributes of Allah. Second, I'd talk about the meaning of the verse that as it applies to the concept of evolution, drawing from other material in my studies of the Holy Quran for the past 2 decades or so. And then finally, the utility and lessons from this verse that I believe apply to all of us, and particularly to Ahmadi Muslim scientists. So first, the verse which I recited earlier, Huvallahul Khaliqul Bariul Musawwirul Asmaul Husna, Yusabbihu lahu ma fis samawati wal arz, wa huwal azizul hakim, translates as follows: He is Allah, the creator, the maker, the fashioner. His are the most beautiful names. All that is in the heavens and the earth glorifies him, and he is mighty and wise. The verse is from Surah Al-Hashr, chapter 59 of the Holy Quran. In it, Allah is describing 3 attributes that are characteristic of his being. These 3 attributes in Arabic are Al-Khaliq, Al-Bari, and Al-Musawwir, which translate roughly to the creator, the maker, and the fashioner. Notice how all 3 translations appear to be synonymous with the concept of creation. So the first question that comes to mind is, why would the Quran provide all 3 words if they are synonymous? Why not just use only one? Well, the answer to that question lies in the meaning of the Arabic words for creator, maker, and fashioner, Al-Khaliq, Al-Bari, and Al-Musawwir, which are generally congruent but have very distinct meanings. In his Friday sermon of May 7th, 2010, our present Hazur, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad Ayatollah bin Nasr Aziz, focused on the first of these divine attributes, Al-Khaliq. He noted that Khaliq connotes creation from nothing. Creation from nothing. To generate something without any previous ingredients or raw materials. When used with the prefix al, as in Al-Khaliq, Hazur Ayatollah bin Nasr Aziz mentioned that this only signifies the name for God, no one else. He also mentioned another meaning of this word, which is actually very curious. It's to ascertain things or to measure them, to take one's full measure before creation. The emphasis in this attribute is on creating something according to a set of laws or parameters that provide the conditions for the object's existence. Indeed, according to Edward William Lane's Arabic lexicon, which is considered an authoritative source of Arabic root word translations, the word khaliq means the act of measuring, or determining the measure or proportion of a thing, or the making of a thing by measure. It also means creating after a pattern or a model, which one has devised, not after something that's pre-existing, but wholly original. This reminds me of the famous quotation by the late astronomer Carl Sagan. He said, "If I had to bake an apple pie from scratch, I would have to first create the universe." And so what this implies is that we often are in the process in our daily lives of engendering or creating something. But what we don't realize that we are not the true creators, but there is a creative process in play that sets the stage for us to do our creative work. And that has to be in place before you can bake your own apple pie. And this is the meaning behind Al-Khaliq, the idea that you create something as a set of laws and a framework that then provide the benefits for further creation. So what about the second of the mentioned attributes, Al-Bari? In contrast to Al-Khaliq, Al-Bari, or the maker, according to lexicons, has a root word which means free of fault, and to create something without a blemish. Now that's interesting. According to the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam, whereas Al-Khaliq encompasses all of creation, Al-Bari usually is referred to as the creation of living things without fault. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah of the Holy Quran, chapter 2, verse 55, God admonishes idol worshippers to turn to their master, to turn to Al-Bari, who made them without fault, rather than to material objects that the idol worshippers themselves had fashioned, imperfectly. Al-Bari also refers to creating objects not from scratch, but from pre-existing matter. So that's also very different than Al-Khaliq, which is creation from scratch. Finally, the attribute of Musawwir is mentioned, which translates to one who forms, sculpts, or fashions an object. This refers to working to form or embellish pre-existing material, connoting artistry, to bestow form or shape on something. In his Friday sermon of February 14th, 2003, Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad Rahmatullah alayhi, the fourth Khalifa of the promised Messiah alayhi salam, noted that Al-Musawwir refers to God perhaps creating in his own image or likeness. Now, what does that mean? That means that Allah is fashioning things and imbuing within those creative forms attributes of his own. And that is where we all are taught to reflect those attributes that are in God. And by reflecting those attributes, we are embodying those noble tendencies that we are supposed to strive for. Okay, so that was part one, and now that we know the meanings behind these attributes, what is the meaning of this verse? And how does it relate to evolution? Well, having gone through these basic definitions, what can we make of this? The first thing that one is immediately struck by is the order of their placement in the verse. Okay? Al-Khaliq, then Al-Bari, then Al-Musawwir. Nearly 1,000 years ago, the Muslim scholar and polymath Al-Ghazali in Iran was also struck by this order in the Quran, in this verse. And he interpreted it to be significant. And what he said is that he likens it to that of stages in the construction of a house, where one plans, perhaps has blueprints or a design, a set of measures. Al-Khaliq is to measure. And then one builds the house under the attribute of Al-Bari, and then decorates it or adorns it with smaller, finer form. Indeed, I find this general impression to resonate with me, as it makes sense that the attribute of Al-Khaliq, which it involves taking measures and planning as one creates, would come before the actual construction of the house or the object, and then once built, undergo further refinement. But for me, however, I wish to further elaborate on what I feel this order might signify. And this is where now I arrive at some of my own personal thoughts about this verse and in the order in which these attributes are presented. First, like Al-Ghazali has observed and many others no doubt since then, I find that the use of the three attributes in this verse is very significant and suggests that the intention is to showcase those aspects that are unique to each of these attributes in order for a reason. Moreover, these three distinct qualities of these three attributes, I would argue, are measurement, with the intent to create something within measured limits, making unblemished or timeless structure from existing materials, and fashioning or sculpting finer form. I would argue that this sequence represents a temporal arrangement too. There's a starting, middle, and end to this. That is how our universe and its constituents were created. Okay. From the general establishment of laws and fundamentals, the constraints of that system of laws and forces, and the development and formation of life as we know it. So what do I mean by this? Well, take, for example, the attribute of Khaliq. According to current prevailing estimates, the universe formed from the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. The Big Bang was an expansion of space that ultimately has yielded what? It yielded our laws of physics, the fundamental forces that we hold as basically the limits for our universe. The forces of gravitation, strong nuclear and weak nuclear force, electromagnetism within which all structures are constrained. Many theorists have asked the question, why the upper and lower bounds of our universe are the way they are. For example, why can't we go faster than the speed of light? What is the constancy inherent in the gravitational constant, and so forth? My belief is that the idea of Allah being Al-Khaliq is consistent with his creating a set of laws, measures, which have been placed and within which structures are created. Thus, I place Al-Khaliq as that amazing attribute that is consistent with our sense of a measured universe based on the laws of physics. These starting conditions are a prerequisite to life as we know it today. Now, if you go back to the Sagan quotation on the apple pie and how you have to create the universe first in order to create an apple pie from scratch, you have to think about the conditions we normally don't think about when we bake an apple pie. We normally don't think about air pressure, but that has an effect on this. Those of you who live at altitudes know that baking something takes longer and it's a little different than baking something at sea level. These starting conditions actually affect the creative process. And this is what I mean by the starting conditions of the universe. We can't have further creation unless the laws of physics are established. And so the Big Bang and the beginning of this universe reflects this attribute of a measured universe of Al-Khaliq. And without that, the concept of creation is actually meaningless. So next in the sequence comes Allah's attribute in this order of al-Bari, which is to create an unblemished structural system based on pre-existing materials. Now here, those materials have formed from the Big Bang, creating our fundamental elements: hydrogen, helium, the remaining elements from the vast stellar nurseries that have fueled our existence since time began. The calcium in our bones, the sodium in our salt, the soil and minerals of our earth, all come from this material, which ended up forming galaxies, stars, planets harboring life, such as Earth, and perhaps others. This reminds me of the historian George Dyson remarking in his book, Turing's Cathedral, about a time when he was 3 years old. And he was walking home one day with his father, who was a famous physicist, Freeman Dyson. And they were walking back from his work at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton University. The young George saw a broken fan belt from an automobile, a rubber fan belt on the road, and innocently asked his father, "Dad, what is that?" His father replied solemnly, "It is a piece of the sun." This profound statement of a fan belt of an automobile representing a piece of the sun has a deep significance. It underscores the nature of our true origins. We are all made of stardust, the product of billions and billions of years of processes in the cosmos. And according to Islamic belief, the rearrangements of that pre-existing material under the attribute of al-Bari forms living systems today. And that rearrangement is under that attribute. And so what's really beautiful is that these rearrangements of pre-existing materials created by Allah as al-Bari are within the constraints of a system of fundamental forces and physical laws that He has created as al-Khaliq. By now you must be wondering about evolution. At this stage of the process between Allah as al-Bari and perhaps in the third attribute as al-Musawwir, we find ourselves learning how these attributes govern the profound transition and rearrangement of physical matter on our planet, in our soil, in our minerals, in our oceans. It is here that we can find the beginnings of a chemical evolutionary process embedded within this described transition. Scientists posit that life's origins on Earth began from a primordial soup of inorganic and organic material that underwent a set of chemical transformations. The mix of these constituents under the right starting conditions is believed to set forth a series of molecular transformations of increasing complexity, culminating in the formation of living systems, single-celled organisms, and photosynthetic life. That this involved water and minerals from organic sediments is no doubt correct. And the Quran, too, describes this process, life from clay. But how the transition of prebiotic to biotic life on Earth happens remains still an active area of investigation. We don't know all the answers to this yet in science. But it is here where the attribute of Musawwir, the fashioner, comes to relevance, since this attribute is one which describes the creative force that gives rise to forms and shapes, sculpted from pre-existing material. As the transition to organic life occurs, countless forms of increasing complexity evolved, including the evolution of organisms that possess genetic material that promotes their reproductive capacities. And that is a good starting point where a discussion of evolutionary principles can be reviewed and its parallels in the Quran described. In the mid-19th century, a series of careful observations were carried out by two naturalists, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Both, Darwin and Wallace, undertook expeditions to remote areas of the planet and began wondering at the enormous variation in animals and plants they found. Darwin had traveled around the world in the mid-1830s, around the time that the promised Messiah ﷺ was born. on the scientific vessel known as the Beagle, and Wallace traveled to the Amazon basin and later the Malay archipelago. Both wrote regularly of their findings, reporting them in monographs and journals. Gradually, they started exploring the idea of how such animals and their distributions change over time, and how well they are adapted to their environments. Influenced tremendously by the work of contemporary scientists, most notably Sir Charles Lyell, who published an influential 3-volume treatise on geology, which, by the way, Charles Darwin took with him on board the Beagle. Both scientists started to examine changes in living organisms on geologic timescales. Both scientists also started writing to one another. And Darwin, who was in wider social circles at the time, invited Wallace to have his paper on the subject of natural selection jointly read with Darwin's at a scientific meeting in 1858 at the meeting of the Linnaean Society in London. And their work was jointly published in the Linnaean Society Journal. Thus, Darwin and Wallace are credited as co-discovering the idea that natural selection forms the basis of divergence of species, with each scientist emphasizing different factors responsible: competition among rivals or environmental pressures. The overall ideas are very complex. And here I would like to summarize very simply, rather than making it a class on Evolution 101, just 3 conditions that Darwin posits that can be summarized succinctly as being necessary for evolution. Number 1, there needs to exist a variation of traits in a population. This trait, number 2, must be heritable. It must be able to pass on. This difference has to be passed on to its offspring. And number 3, the expression of this trait should contribute to differences in that offspring's reproductive success in the future. If you have these 3 conditions, you should be able to see evolutionary change occurring in populations. For example, if there is a variation in, say, bird calls, where a bird is calling to a mate or calling to advertise to a rival that they're in territory, if those calls are all of a sudden happening in a territory that gets all of a sudden destroyed by deforestation, suddenly this allows the, say, higher pitched call of one bird to be heard easier now that the canopy and the echo chamber of the forest is removed, and the lower frequency sound of another bird is not heard. Then all of a sudden, there is a selective advantage conferred on that bird that has the higher call. And if it contributes to a difference in reproductive success, then the offspring of that bird will propagate that same genetic pattern. And over time, that population's frequency of genes will increase over the ones with the lower frequency. And the genes will then flow across these populations this way over time. And today we know, and Darwin at the time did not know about genes, but we know that this is due to the flow of genetic material in a population. And there are complex interactions scientists know and classify for these types of gene flow. So the attribute of al-Bari and perhaps of al-Musawwir appears to operate on this scale, the scale of populations and organisms. The rearrangement and recombination of existing genetic material can lead to new traits and, under certain events, new organisms, a hallmark of the evolutionary process. And this dovetails well with the notion of rearrangement in these attributes of Allah. At this stage, considering that we are on the subject of evolution, I would like to take a quick departure from the verses of chapter 59 under examination and present some of my reflections on a few additional verses of the Quran Kareem that I've been studying for the past 2 decades. These verses are in chapter 51, Surah Al-Zariyat. Allah Ta'ala says, in the name of Allah, the Gracious, the Merciful, وَالزَّارِيَاتِ زَرْوًا, by those that scatter with a true scattering, فَالْحَامِلَاتِ ذِكْرًا, then they carry a load, فَالْجَارِيَاتِ يُسْرًا, they speed lightly along, فَالْمُقَسِّمَاتِ أَمْرًا, and they redistribute by our command. Now, this is a sequence that has been presented Again, by those that scatter with a true scattering, they carry a load, they speed lightly along, redistribute by our command. It's almost like a riddle. Notice in these verses that as with the verse we have been examining in Surah Al-Hashr, there is a definite order and sequence to these events. We first have as a state where objects, particles in this case, are scattered in what is a state of true scattering or independence. These particles get marked, they bear a load, and become unburdened as they flow through the system, and then redistribute in their organization. I find these verses to be remarkable because they appear to describe many different levels of natural phenomena. For example, you can imagine wind that's scattered, carries a load of moisture, and then redistributes it as clouds giving rain. You can imagine these verses describing blood picking up oxygen in your body and traveling and bearing up that load and redistributing that oxygen on command. After I was assigned this speech, a few months ago, I was restudying these verses, and I realized that the conditions I described that are needed for evolution are actually matching up rather well with the steps described in these verses. Recall that there needs to be variation in traits of a population, akin to the scattering of things independently in these verses. These traits need to be heritable, the second condition of evolution, which would mean that they would need to be encoded or marked on genes. So these genes are now bearing a load. They're bearing a heritability. These traits that were once independent and scattered are now actually being transmitted by a loaded code. And finally, they need to contribute to differences in reproductive success. That is, they need to confer an ease of survival for an organism, allowing the genes to speed lightly along and redistributing the population by command. So this is my interpretation, of course. It needs further support, and the topic of how Quranic interpretation is constrained by various ground rules is a larger topic I do not have the liberty to touch upon here. Suffice it to say that one criteria for correct interpretation is further support from other Quranic verses, which this has, as well as consistency of the interpretation with accepted authoritative commentaries. I invite the audience or those who may watch this later to consider these verses and their interpretation further. To close my talk, I would like to explore an Islamic teaching we all try to follow. That is, we are enjoined as Muslims to emulate the attributes of the divine in our own lives as much as possible. How can this be achieved for Al-Khaliq, Al-Bari, and Al-Musawwir? Well, as a scientist, I marvel at the seamlessness of cosmic scales to planetary scales, to organismal scales, to molecular scales, as mentioned in this verse. The movement from Al-Khaliq to Al-Bari to Al-Musawwir. These scales are very difficult to see fully. And much of my life's work as a scientist is a struggle to reveal the causes and their effects on these scales all the way through from one end of the scale to another. For example, my PhD work focused on neuroscience and how the brain controls hunger and our food intake. I hypothesized that a series of chemical messengers in the brain stimulate hunger. To demonstrate this, I would perform experiments that would introduce a chemical into the brain, and my measure was a readout of whether I could see food intake changes or not. In between this chemical at a molecular scale and the food intake at a behavioral scale were a number of scales at the level of receptors in the brain, cells, circuits, tissue, the whole body. Yet I knew very little of those scales and I could not visualize them. We often are unaware of the scales in between things. Indeed, when Charles Darwin himself formulated together with Wallace their ideas concerning the conditions of evolution, they did not know the existence of genes or the existence of DNA. What's cool about this is that not knowing scales is both daunting to a scientist, but it's also very, very interesting that we can often discover much without knowing those scales. As if Allah has provided a mercy to the scientist in making some of the details in each scale or the laws governing each scale somewhat divorced from the scales above or below it. I want to share a beautiful passage from one of my favorite science books of all time, a book called The Character of Physical Law by the late physicist Richard Feynman. In it, he describes the notion of scales and how each concept gets more complex, and when you get more complex, you understand it less. For example, he studied the fundamental forces like gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear force. But when you start to move from the fundamental forces to something like heat, all of a sudden it gets a lot more complex. So he writes here, as we go up in this hierarchy of complexity, we get to things like muscles or nerve impulses, which are enormously complicated things in the physical world, involving an organization of matter in a very elaborate complexity. Then come things like frog. And then we go on and we move to words and concepts like man, history, politics, and so forth. A series of concepts which we use to understand things at an ever higher level. And going on, we come to things like evil and beauty and hope. So he writes further here, and I think this is very beautiful. He writes, which is nearer to God, if I may use a religious metaphor? Beauty and hope, or the fundamental laws? I think that the right way, of course, is to say that we have to look at the whole structural interconnection of the whole thing. And that all the sciences, and not just the sciences, but all the efforts of all intellectuals, are an endeavor to see the connections and the hierarchies, to connect beauty to history, history to man's psychology to the working of the brain to the neural impulse to the chemistry, and so forth. Up and down, both ways along this chain. And today, he says, today, we cannot, and it is no use making believe that we can, draw carefully a line all the way from one end of this thing to the other, because we have only just begun to see that there's this hierarchy. And he writes further, I do not think either end is nearer to God. To stand at either end and to walk off that end of the pier only, hoping only that direction is complete understanding, is a mistake. And to stand with evil and beauty and hope, or to stand with fundamental laws, hoping that way is a deeper understanding, that aspect alone is a mistake. The great mass of workers in between, connecting one step to another, are improving all the time our understanding of the world, from both working at the ends to working in the middle. And in that way, we are gradually understanding this tremendous world of interconnecting hierarchies. In closing, I would like to emphasize the theme of this Jalsa, which focuses on the conditions of Ba'ath, or the initiation into the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. The topic I have just touched upon in this address has really to do with whether we believe in the existence of a creator. As a scientist, I cannot prove that, nor am I taught in my religion, in Islam, that I should. The founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community writes in his seminal work, Promised Messiah Islam writes in Brahine Ahmadiyya, and I end my speech with this quote, when one observes Allah's creation and finds the design of this universe to be perfect and flawless, one can only conclude, by way of conjecture and thinking, that there ought to be a creator of this creation. However, there is a great difference between the import of ought to be and is. There is an element of doubt in ought to be, and it does not bring about the degree of certainty that is can. When a person says by way of conjecture that such and such is a thing that ought to be, he means to say only that it has to exist, so far as his reasoning is concerned, but he's unable to say whether or not it actually exists. This is why, and this is what Masih himself says, is this is why all those who have been restricting themselves to the study of nature, this includes myself and others, scientists, have never agreed upon a conclusion, neither do they now, nor will it be ever possible in the future. So what Masih al-Islam is declaring that scientists can only go so far. They can only go so far. And he writes here, think hard, and you will realize that to arrive at complete certainty without revelation or ilham is not possible. Nor is it possible to escape error or to base oneself truly on tawheed or to overcome one's passions. It is revelation, experiential revelation, through which we are able to affirm that God is. In the end, I offer you my greetings at the start of this auspicious Jalsa and pray that we ponder on these words. And as we as scientists continue to explore and test the limits set forth by our Creator in order to understand his vast system, as Feynman says, of interconnecting hierarchies of scale, both in space and in time. Thank you.
Jazakumullah.